Good evening, and welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Andrew, and I'm one of the event staffers here. For those of you who don't know, PNP hosts many events at our two branches at the Wharf and Union Market, as well as this location, which has been here for over 35 years. At this point, we host close to 1,000 authors a year, so if you're a relative newcomer, welcome, and we'd love to have you with us for some more. Print calendars for 2020 are available at our information desk and our website. To start things off tonight, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. We audio and video record our events whenever possible, and we'd hate for there to be ringing sounds interrupting that recording. And since there will be time for your questions in the back half of the program, and so that those questions are captured on the recording, please come up to the standing microphone that we've placed at the end of this aisle. And please do keep your question a question. That's best for keeping the conversation flowing and allowing for more time for folks to step up to the mic. And then, after the talk, you'll find many copies of tonight's book behind our registers, so you can grab a copy or two and then meet us back up here for the book signing. Before you do that, we'd love for you to fold up your chairs, which would be a huge help in putting the store back in place post-event. Now, it's my honor to introduce Peggy Wallace Kennedy and Diane McWhorter. Born into one of the most powerful political families in the history of the American South, Peggy Wallace Kennedy is recognized as one of America's most important voices for peace and reconciliation. From her unique perspective of living behind the gates of the Alabama governor's mansion, as her father, George Wallace, rose to become one of America's most influential populists, Peggy Wallace Kennedy offers a compelling narrative of her family's history and its relevance to the current version of the politics of rage. In the summer of 1963, though she was just a young girl watching her father stand in a schoolhouse door as he tried to block two African-American students from entering the University of Alabama, this man, former governor of Alabama and presidential candidate George Wallace, was notorious for his hateful rhetoric and his political stunts. But he was also a larger-than-life father to young Peggy, who was taught to smile, sit straight, and not speak up as her father took to the political stage. The Broken Road speaks to change, atonement, activism, and racial reconciliation. This event is in conversation with both Peggy Wallace Kennedy and Diane McWhorter. Diane McWhorter is a writer for narrative fiction, nonfiction based in D.C. Her first book, Carry Me Home, Birmingham, Alabama, the climactic battle for the Civil Rights Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize in 2002, chronicled the Civil Rights Revolution and her family's role on the wrong side of it in her hometown. She is also the author of A Dream of Freedom, the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. McWhorter is a graduate of Wellesley College and was a longtime contributor to the New York Times and has written for many other publications. Please help me welcome Peggy Wallace Kennedy and Diane McWhorter.
Hello. Is this on? It is, okay. Is it on? Okay. I think there are a lot of Alabama expats here tonight if they brave the snow. So, yay! Roll Tide! War Eagle, okay. So, I first became aware of Peggy when I read an article that she had written for CNN.com in 2008. And it was about visiting her parents' graves in a Montgomery cemetery and being greeted there by a fan of her parents who said that George would have rolled over in his grave if he had known that a black man was running for president. And the piece that the woman, the fan of her parents, greeted Peggy and said that George Wallace would have rolled over in his grave if he had known that a black man was running for president. This was in November of 2008. And the piece unfolds, and Peggy ends up getting into her car and with the Obama sticker on it. And when I have to say that as a product of Alabama, and someone for whom George Wallace was probably the defining public figure in my life, and followed me after I left Alabama after high school, because he was the thing that everybody knew about the state, and I was always constantly having to either explain him or whatever. And when I read that, I just felt this almost physical feeling of kind of absolution and redemption wash over me, because it was just the closest I had come to feeling like there was hope for my state, really. And so I had I was invited to speak for the 50th anniversary of the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door at the University of Alabama in 2013. And when they invited me, I said, I'll do it if you'll get Peggy Wallace to introduce me. And so that's how we met. And I also met her husband, Mark, Justice Mark Kennedy, who was a judge on the Alabama Supreme Court, who's a legend in his own right. And so here we are tonight.
Yes, here we are.
So Peggy, let's start. Like a lot of these memoirs of famous figures, famous controversial figures, follow kind of a home devil, street angel, or vice versa formula. This is not that. George is pretty consistently like bad throughout.
Yes.
but one of the things that Southerners are always having to explain to people is how, or something that we understand is how you can love people whose behavior and beliefs you abhor, and that really very much comes across in the book. But the book, let's just talk a little bit about the book is so different from I had George Wallace is a big character in Carry Me Home, and I came to see him as this kind of tragic figure because he was actually began as a liberal. He was sort of a typical labor left liberal, and he has to sell his soul in order to win. And so reading Peggy's book brings such a different perspective on everything because it's just so personal in particular. And let's begin. Let's sort of talk about when you move from these little ratty apartments into the governor's mansion. This is the day of the famous inaugural speech: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And your mother, Lurleen Wallace, who ends up succeeding him as governor, says, "Oh my God, you can have whatever you want to eat now, anytime you want it." So talk a little bit about what your life was leading up to that moment that you take over the governor's mansion.
Well, in '58, of course, the governor's race that he ran in '58, he lost. And up until that time, he was a judge, and Mom was a housewife, so I had a steady paycheck coming in. But when he lost the '58 race, my father was devastated. He started running for the '62 race the day after he lost, and he would do anything to win that '62 race, and he put all he had into that race because that's what he wanted to be, was the governor of Alabama. So he had neglected everything else in his life. And of course, when he ran in '58, he was no longer a circuit judge. His brother ran for that spot and won that spot. So,
and as a judge, he had been known as liberal in terms of sentencing African American defendants.
yes.
And also calling black judges by Mr., which was unusual
yes.
then. They were called Lawyer Jones in order to get around the honorific.
Yes. And so we did without a lot of times food, and Mother did the very best that she could, but it was very, very hard times. And at one point, we had to move to our grandparents' home down outside of Tuscaloosa, and Mother would drive from Clayton to Tuscaloosa, and she would cross the Black Warrior River and when she did that, she would say, "Now look for the broken road." And the broken road was an abandoned road bed, and it was a piece of asphalt that was cracked up, heaved up, and it was covered with kudzu vines and shrub trees, and we called it the broken road because it looked like it was broken to us. And it was very close to our grandparents' house, so Mama would always say, "Look for the broken road." And we knew that when we saw the broken road, we were close to unconditional love and happiness, no secrets and no angry voices. And then Mother would turn down the dirt road, and I would start looking for the house with the flowers on the porch. And when I saw the house with the flowers on the porch, I'd roll down the window and wave, and happiness would wave me back. And so we lived there for quite a while, and Mother filed for divorce in Greene County. And when she went to the courthouse to file, he said, "Under what do you call it? Under what
Grounds.
And what grounds?" She said, "All of them."
This was after the 58 race.
This was after the 58 race, when he just neglected us, and we had no income coming in, and so there was everything was it was very bad. So when she filed for divorce, she became the smartest woman he knew, and she held all the cards, and she knew it, and he knew it after that. Because nobody runs for governor that's divorced and has little children running around going, "Where's Daddy? Where's Daddy? Where's Daddy?" And she knew that. And so so he ran in 62, and we moved into the governor's mansion, and it was country come to town, I'll tell you, it was.
But you adjusted.
But we adjusted, and that's when Mother did say, she said, "You can have anything you want to eat."
Do you remember going hungry, though? In those,
Yes, in Clayton, I do, and that's why she moved us to my grandparents' house. Yes.
And Lurleen had married your father when she was 16.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about their courtship. He had graduated from the University of Alabama Law School.
Yes.
And he was how much older? 6 years?
Yes,
no, more than that.
Well,
yeah.
Yes.
No, he would have been like 8 years older at least. Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I think so. Yes, but my grandmother, Mama, who is a wonderful character in the book, and that was my mother's mother, and Mr. Henry. I called my grandfather Mr. Henry, but my Mama, she had red hair and she was about that tall, and she didn't like him from the beginning. I can tell you right now, and she didn't let. She didn't care who knew it, and
especially him.
Right. When Mother was elected governor, she said, "Well, George, I guess you can thank Lurleen now. You got a roof over your head and food to eat." I mean, she just didn't care what she said to him. It was wonderful, and but she was wonderful. And what was your question?
There was well, to back up, like I'm always like looking for what somebody's wound is there, because we all have a wound, right, in childhood that sort of puts us on our path.
Yes.
And if you can turn that wound into an asset, you've won the game of life. And I think you described that the scene that made me understand him in a visceral way that I never understood was the scene of there's a whole tradition. My Jewish in-laws never understood the tradition of downward mobility in the South. My father was downwardly mobile, and George's grandfather had been a doctor, and his father was a complete screw up.
Yeah, yes.
And so the scene that you describe about him, and George became a bantamweight boxer, and of some have some talent.
Yes.
And tell the scene about what,
Well,
was it Clayton or Clio?
It's Clio.
Clio, yeah.
And they lived in Clio, and there were three boys, and my daddy's father was an alcoholic, and he would come home at night, and his mother, my daddy's mother, was very stoic and very just, never said anything, but he would move all the furniture back and all the rugs and everything, and make the boys box each other. And the telephone, I think it was a telephone place, was across the street, and so they could see into the living room of the home. So when they had Daddy's daddy had a deal with the person over here,
The operator, yeah.
the operator, that would ding the bell when however minutes were up and the round would be over. And so they would box, and I mean, they would really have to go at it, because their father would just make them really box. And the operator, when it would get so bad, he'd ring the bell early, and because the boys were just beating each other up. And Moselle, their mother, was just very stoic. She never tried to stop it. She never tried to say this isn't good for the boys. The blood and everything is just really not good. And it just was. It really just it developed his personality to such where. When he would have fights with my mother, he would fight with her in such a way that he had to be right, and he would follow her around until she finally would say, "You're right," and she would just give in and say, "You're right." I mean, that's
because she would try to just kind of withdraw, but
would
that was
try
not
to
acceptable.
withdraw.
Yeah,
And he would not let her, because that's what his mother did. She would withdrawn and very stoic, and wouldn't, would not stop those fights for those boys. It was awful. Yeah.
Well, and then Peggy, tell about the hidden grandmother, George's grandmother, that you found out about.
Yes, several years ago we someone died in Montgomery, and one of my cousins came to the funeral, and we were talking about our family tree, and her daughter had done the whole family tree, and we found out that Daddy's grandmother, Moselle's mother, lived in Montgomery and died in 1968, and nobody knew it. And so we were all so shocked. Where did she live? I mean, she saw her grandson elected governor. She saw her grandson's wife elected governor, and no one ever knew it.
Yeah.
And she died in 1968.
So
no one ever knew it.
So in other words, the family had issues.
Yeah. Yes, you could say that. Yes, yes.
So Peggy, I know that you'll get this question, so I'm going to ask it because I get it all the time. If you read Peggy's book, every now and then a sibling will be mentioned, and you'll go and you'll think, oh, I thought Peggy was an only child, because they are not in the book, and by and large, and except for maybe they show up when they're born or something. And is there? And you are not. They took a different path than you did. And is there anything that you look back on that that you can identify as what helped you see things differently, especially during your father's first term? Because that was the first term beginning in 1963 was the church bombing, the Selma and Montgomery March, and all the sort of greatest hits of the Civil Rights era. Was there anything that made you? Because in my case, there was no. Everybody wants there to be an epiphany, and to me, that's almost never the case. But was there But sometimes you look back and say, that made an impression. What would you say was during that first term? Because you were in junior high then.
Yes. Well, for me, I just disagreed. I just disagreed with this politics. And lived through the civil rights era with all the events, and it was just it was hard to live through them, and knowing that your father had created the climate that, with his actions and words and deeds, that made other people plant 15 sticks of dynamite under the church.
And do you feel like you were aware of that at the time?
Not at the time. I really didn't come to the realization of that until I was an adult. I don't know if I was pushing it away or not, but that's really what the book is about. Is about accepting your past, not to forget it, but to accept it. And that's what I did. And I came to the realization that during the 60s and all the turmoil and everything, he created that climate. And only he did. And I did an interview in Atlanta, and they played a piece of tape, and he actually said on the tape, he was on Face the Nation, he said, yes, a few people got hurt on that bridge, yes, I know that, but 10 people were murdered in Detroit, I'm sure. And I was just stunned. I was stunned. And he said, yes, that poor woman was murdered in that car by some thug. And I was stunned. And I thought, I just couldn't believe that he was on national TV and saying that. That's the first time I'd ever heard that tape. So, yeah, it was really.
Well, in the book, I was kind of surprised at how early your high school was desegregated, but that made an impression on you that the black students that you were now going to school with were being vilified by him, and that at the time that struck you, right?
Well, I wanted to welcome them when they were there, but I couldn't. I was surrounded by bodyguards. So Dolores Boyd, who is she was one of the 11 that were that integrated my high school. She's a good friend of ours today, and they went through a lot, but I like I said, I wanted to welcome them. I thought they should go there, and I didn't see anything wrong. Just like University of Alabama, when I was 13.
Did your mother ever? So one of the great things about the book is that it really brings Lurleen Wallace to life. She was the kind of conventional wisdom in Alabama is that, and you did not know this at the time, but she had a bad cancer diagnosis at the time that George that she ran for governor in the state of Alabama. The governor couldn't succeed himself, and the reason it had been. I just saw somebody. The reason the state constitution had been written that way was that the vested interests, the industrialists and the big planners were able to maintain control of the legislature, and so they vested all the power in the legislature, but they couldn't really necessarily control the governor's office because it was a popular vote, so that a statewide vote. So Alabama had this history of liberal governors, of whom George was one, and these sort of liberal populists. And so, anyway, so that was initially a governor's. They only served for 2 years, and the way they built up power was through patronage. So they wanted to cut that short, and so they didn't allow them to succeed himself. So when he tried to pass a succession bill at the end of his first term, and when it failed, he ran Lurleen. And so when I was reading Peggy's book, though, and that was another one of Big Bad George's actions, which is he made his wife run because he was so power hungry. But it sounded like she was sort of fulfilling some need in herself as well. Did you? How do you look back on that? Because she really seemed to grow in the role, right?
Yes, she did, and she had her reasons for running. I'd like to read some passages from, if I could.
Mm-hmm.
I did not want her to run for governor. She called all of the kids in one at a time and asked us what our opinion was, and I was the only one that said I did not want her to run. I wanted her to stay home and be with and be with me. So in the winter and spring months of 1968, Mama never told me she was dying. There were no conversations about moving on without her. We never reminisced or recapitulated. We never talked about what she might want me to tell my children one day when they asked who she was and what kind of grandmother she would have been. Perhaps she had hope until the final moments of her life and was unable to accept her destiny. More likely, she didn't want to burden me as I was preparing to graduate from high school. Mama did not live long enough to tell her own story. There were no diaries, no handwritten letters to us, no family movies, and only a few family photographs scattered about. The person that my mama was and the person she could have become, had she lived, will always elude me. The author Anita Smith described Mama as a lady of courage in her book, The Intimate Story of Lurleen Wallace, her crusade of courage. Ron Gibson, the book's editor, wrote in the introduction, "She rushed onto the stage of history only in time for a brief, if nonetheless memorable, performance before the lights went out. The audience applauded her dignity in the role in which she was cast. It is because the reader will come to know such a figure, tragic as her circumstance may finally have been." The real story of Mama's life became irrelevant to history and eventually even to her own family. I became accustomed to not only looking beyond the stories that we always told, the ones with a punchline rather than those with depth. Back in Clayton when I was young, Mama would sometimes come to visit. The make-believe houses I would scratch out with a tree limb, a broom handle on the dirt floor of our sagging garage. She helped make my floor plan more livable. She brought glasses of Kool-Aid for the two of us, and we would sit in metal yard chairs in my living room. "One day you will have a real house," she would say, "so when I come to visit, be sure you have a room for me." I always promised I would. In 1977, I moved into a real house of my own, and in June of 1978, I brought Mama's grandson, Lee Chancellor Kennedy, home to live in what would have been her room. Lee's serene curiosity was unruffled and unafraid. A decade later, our son Morgan Burns Kennedy was born. His eyes narrowed when something went awry. His smiles were discreet. There was no doubt in my mind that Burns Kennedy had the no monkey business around here soul of Mama. He would have her tell it like it is, ain't no use in sugarcoating it personality. When Burns became animated and restless in my arms, and stared at me through squinting eyes, his hands balled up in boxer style. I wished I could call on Mama or Mama. I pulled him close to comfort him, but he was comfortless. He was upset, but was not crying. "Are you about to pitch a fit?" I asked. How I wish I could ask Mama or Mama what to do with you. But they left you and me a long time ago, so I guess it's just us. Burns relaxed and with his eyes wide open, looked straight into mine. It was as if he understood what I said, but disagreed with my opinion. Then somewhere in my heart, I came to understand that all that Mama did, she had done for us. Lurleen Wallace was a woman of courage because of her life, rather than a lady of courage because of her death. I dream about standing in the shallows of the Alabama Gulf with Mama as she cast her rod toward the sky. The silver spinner catches the last light as it arcs up and over the water. "Here, hold the rod for me for a second," Mama says as she cups her hand around a cigarette lighter to fend off a breeze. "Let's get lucky. What do you think?" "Yep, let's get lucky," I reply with a smile. "See that biggest ship heading through the pass?" she asks as she points toward the water. "Watch it now as it heads out to sea. It will look like it's getting smaller and smaller, but it will always stay the same. That's because of the way we see it, not because of the way it really is. Are we like that ship?" I ask. "Are we always the same, even if we are very far away and even when no one can see us?" I think we are. My mother was reminding me that she would always be there with me in spirit. She would endure in my heart as the mother I loved. That would never change. So what my mother had done while she was governor was she bought a house in Montgomery. She furnished it, and that was left for us. So we had a home. So when she passed away, we had everything that we would need.
Yeah, she was the provider.
Yes, she was.
You could almost, when I was reading the book, I was thinking you could almost organize it, or you could almost think of it as the women of George Wallace, with you getting the last word, because the women, in a way, are more vivid. And George goes on to marry Cornelia Snively, who was, anyway, she was the niece of Big Jim Folsom, who was a legendary governor who had been sort of George's liberal mentor. And I see the former Washington correspondent for the Birmingham News is here, Olivia Barton Ferreter, who had an encounter with George and his third wife, Lisa, who was part of a country singing act called Mona and Lisa, two sisters. And neither of those marriages lasted. Cornelia ended up wiretapping his phone lines. But anyway, there's so many people here. I'm gonna open it up to questions now. But I want to just close by saying that when I remember when the book opens with Peggy walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, hand in hand with John Lewis. And he got in touch with you after the CNN piece, right?
I was invited to come to Selma to introduce then Attorney General Eric Holder, and they put all the speakers in a room, and there was John Lewis, and John Lewis came over and sat down beside me, and and he said, "Hello," and I said, "Hello," and he said, "I'm from Pike County," and I said, "Well, I went to Troy." He said, "Well, I tried to go to Troy." He said, "But I couldn't." So he said, "I called Dr. King," and Dr. King said, "Well, why don't you just come and work for me?" And we've been fast friends ever since. And John Lewis's friendship is one of the great gifts of my lifetime. and I love John Lewis and all that he is.
One of the, Wallace went on an apology tour at the end of his life, and John was one of the ones that Congressman Lewis was one of the ones he apologized to, and I remember I'll close with this with when I met you, and Wallace was reelected in '82 against a qualified liberal candidate. He won the primary against the Lieutenant Governor George McMillan. So and what put it over was the black vote. And I remember the headlines were always, was he really sincere in his apologies? And I remember our dinner got to the profound place of what's worse, if you do it and believe it, or you do it and you don't believe it, right?
Right.
And that's sort of the legacy and the mystery of George Wallace, right? So, okay, so shall I call on the Southern Olivia? Do you have anything to say? Oh,
no, it's right here.
Yeah, mic's right here.
No, no.
Do identify yourselves, please.
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yep. I'm Sarah. I'm from around Birmingham originally. Haven't lived there for 10 years now, but it's very nice to meet you. Thank you for speaking to us. One thing that I have wondered over the years, seeing your parents' names all over the place, do you feel like there should be some effort made to change, say, I think in Tuscaloosa, there's a Lurleen Wallace highway, there's George Wallace this, George Wallace that, lots of different roads and memorials, things like that, named after them. Do you think that there should be an effort made to change those to someone maybe that has a more positive history?
Well, my father did a lot of good things for Alabama.
Use a mic.
My father did a lot of good things for Alabama, and my mother did too while she was governor. So no, I've never thought about it quite that way. I do hope other people get their credit. Like Martin Luther King Drive, and one of my dearest friends is Bernice King, and we have been on several panels together, and she asked me to come 2 years ago and walk the funeral route on the 50th anniversary of her father's death. So her father, everything is named after her father, and her mother certainly deserves it. And but no, I've never thought about it that way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Howard. Yes. Hi. I guess I'm also part of the Alabama contingent. I was born in Birmingham in 1942, and I was a college classmate of Newt Gingrich at Emory, and I saw him on the campus basically convert Southern racial bigotry into republicanism rather than the Democratic Party. He sort of started that on the Emory campus and rode that train all the way to Speaker of the House here in Washington. But I was aware of the fact that you said that George Wallace had created this atmosphere of racial hatred, but that existed in all the southern states, and all the southern governors were doing exactly the same thing, including Lester Maddox in Georgia, who was promoted by Newt Gingrich back in the day. So I think this thing of hatred, I think it's deeply rooted in all of the places where slavery existed and has been and still is today. And I'm not sure that George Wallace can get that much credit or blame for it. I think it's just there in the soil of the place. Do you feel like he had more than usual responsibility for that, or was he just part of the soup that completely covers the entire South?
Well, he was a more talented politician than most people, so
Well,
he was
yes.
able to convert his message into a national movement. You know, he had a very very significant showings in the presidential, 3 or 4 presidential elections. And I want to jump into about the previous question about the stuff named after your dad. The thing about Wallace was that he was elected after, he continued to be elected after this. So he did, and he repented. So that's kind of different from James Eastland, who was the father of the White Citizens Council, is a longtime senator from Mississippi. And the University of Mississippi's law school library was named after him. And I couldn't understand why there weren't many demonstrations about that. He did not redeem himself. So that could be one argument for not taking down all the signs,
Andrew Sperling, also from Birmingham. I want to ask you about 1970, because I was 9 years old living in Birmingham in 1970. And so those that don't remember the context here, Albert Brewer was a lieutenant governor, and when your mother passed away, Albert Brewer became governor. Then a few months later, in 1970, your father challenged Governor Brewer in the Democratic primary, and those of us from Alabama remember that still goes down in history as the nastiest political race in the history of the state.
Yes.
And I was 9 years old, and rather than being sort of repelled by politics, watching this every day, I became fascinated with politics. And I still, that's what sort of inaugurated me to have this interest in politics, and eventually led me up here to work for several members of the Alabama delegation and in Washington all the years. What do you remember most about that, about how nasty it was, and what was it like, now, still grieving over your mother and watching your father engage in this very nasty campaign with Governor Brewer?
Well, it was nasty, and he had promised Governor Brewer he would not run.
He and your mother were close, correct?
Yes, Governor Brewer and my mother were very close, and he just got up one morning and said, "I'm going to run." That was it.
Did he ask you if you...
No, he didn't have to ask me. And I just sat back and watched, and sparks began to fly. So it was interesting to watch, because it was the nastiest race, and he broke a promise, like most politicians do. But I mean, it was nasty. It was.
Hi, I'm Tim. I am not from Alabama. However, I've been spending a lot of time down there lately, specifically in Leeds and Birmingham. So, sorry about that. I am not from Alabama, FYI, but I've been spending a ton of time down there as of late. And I'm really interested, Peggy. I've been doing a lot of research on that time period in Alabama's history, especially amongst young African-American boys and girls who were born around that time period of your father's inauguration and speech. And there is one person in particular I'm doing research on who was born a month after your father was inaugurated. Now, I'm just kind of curious, from your perspective, what sense have you gotten in regard to what young African American men and women who were born into this time period had to actually deal with in those years following not just your father's tenure, but also that speech in particular?
Well, that speech was probably the most racist speech ever given. I was 12 years old. I was standing to my father's left. And when he said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, and the crowd in front of me just roared and cheered. And I didn't understand those words, but I thought, he said something, and these people loved it, and I couldn't understand it. And there's a film clip that Mark and I found that my mother is sitting to my father's right, and after he says those words, my mother, everyone claps, and my mother coughs. She goes, she does not clap. I've often thought that was interesting. But when he said those words, the African American children, after that, you know, you had so many civil rights events that happened. The 16th Street Baptist Church, Addie Mae Collins and Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, they were 14 years old. Denise McNair was only a baby. She was just 11. And Sarah Collins was the younger sister of Addie Mae. She was 12. She survived. And then the tragedy was that those four little girls didn't know the word hatred, and they certainly didn't know the word martyr. They didn't want to be martyrs. And the tragedy didn't stop there. Johnny Robinson was shot in the back by a policeman just for throwing rocks. And then Virgil Ware was 13. He was my age. He was shot in the back by 2 Eagle Boy Scouts and killed. That speech, to me, did a lot of damage.
And he created the atmosphere for the church bombing by blocking school desegregation that fall with state troopers. He sent them. And I want to just say that, wait, what happened to David Marlin was here? Is he still here? He's in line. So David Marlin, the esteemed David Marlin, Esquire, was a lawyer with the Kennedy Justice Department at the time. And I don't know whether you had any personal interactions with Wallace, but we'll know in a second. So let's move on. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joe Green from Ohio.
Yeah.
Your impressionable years as a little girl was spent under the larger-than-life person of George Wallace. What impact did that have on you in your choice and subsequent decision to bring a man into your life in the form of a husband? And did that impact you in any way politically, socially, relationally, temperamentally, in any way?
Say it again, Joe.
Did the impact of the larger-than-life person of George Wallace in your life impact your decision and eventual selection of a husband?
No. I knew that Daddy liked Mark from the very beginning, and so I just knew. So 2 or 3 weeks after we met, everything, you know, Daddy said, "Well, you think that's the one?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I think that's the one." He said, "Well, I do too." So, and it was very important to me that Daddy approved of who I wanted to marry. It was very important to me. So, there, and Daddy was right. He had pretty good intuition. So, I did good.
You did good.
I want to mention that another legacy of your father's influence is here, Senator Doug Jones.
Yes.
Yay! another person on whom he was imprinted, right? In an oblique way.
Wilbur Wright from Detroit. I think I have what would be an easy question for you. Sometime in the mid-'80s, there was someone running for, I think, state treasurer in Alabama who was, it was the son of George Wallace, who would be your brother.
Yes.
Could you say, he didn't win. Can you tell us a bit about what happened and where, well, more importantly, where he is now?
Well, he's retired from politics, and he's is playing his music that he has loved all his life. He plays the guitar, he writes and produces, he goes to Nashville, and he has his pickers in Nashville that write with him and produce, and they play for him, and he records.
I did talk with him briefly. I had the idea, I was working for a nonprofit at the time, and I had the idea that we should go to the many Southern politicians who had taken the path of George Wallace and supported segregation and racism in general, but didn't believe in it. The most conspicuous ones, of course, the senator from Arkansas, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who in effect said it, and then, of course, Al Gore, who refused to sign the
Southern Manifesto.
Southern Manifesto and then lost. But Sam Nunn and a number of others, Herman Talmadge, all seem to be have taken the path that George Wallace did to support white supremacy and racism just to win office, but didn't believe it. So I talked to your brother while he was running. He supported the idea, but we didn't get beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. David Marlin from the Kennedy Justice Department.
Well, it's true. I was in the Civil Rights Division as a trial lawyer from 1961 to 65, and Alabama was my beat. So I saw a great deal of the injustices and the repercussions of segregation and the vilification of black people that your dad engaged in. But I really wanted to step up here and say that you've made a big difference. I didn't get entirely from Diane's question just what the triggers were that have made you devote so much time and energy to providing reconciliation between the races. I know that in 2013, when you went down for the anniversary of the church bombing in Birmingham, you also made a talk in Macon County because it was the 50th anniversary of the desegregation of the Macon County schools. And Macon County, folks, is the county seat is Tuskegee. And so anyway, I'd appreciate it if you'd talk to us a little bit about your activities that you've been engaging in the state and elsewhere to undo some of the harm that your dad did. But before I leave, I just want to say that Doug Jones, if you have an assistant with you, Doug, it would be a good time to to make a contribution to Doug's campaign. He's running for re-election, and let's hope he can manage that. That's.
Well, let's see if I can make this short and sweet. But in 1996, Mark and I took Burns, our youngest son, he was about 8 or 9, to the Martin Luther King National Museum site in Atlanta. And when he saw the Alabama exhibit, Burns turned to me and he said, "Why did Papa do those things to other people?" And I said, Papa never told me why he did those things to other people, but I know he was wrong. So maybe it'll just be up to you and me to help make things right. From 96 to 2009, I raised my sons. I supported my husband in his political career. And then I was asked to write CNN Peace, and it became very popular, and then they asked me to come to introduce Eric Holder. And I walked across the bridge with John Lewis. And John Lewis gave me the courage and the strength to find my voice, because I never had a voice, and no one asked for my opinion when I was growing up about, what did you think about your dad? What do you think about me standing in the schoolhouse door? We just never talked politics in the family. I didn't have an opinion. No one asked for I didn't have a voice. But John Lewis gave me the courage to find my voice. And I knew that I wanted my sons to have a different legacy than the one that was left for me. And I knew that it had to be something I was passionate about. And peace and reconciliation was what I was passionate about. And so for 10 plus years, I have traveled across the country talking about peace and reconciliation. And the book is the culmination of my work for my two sons that I dedicated the book to, because John Lewis is the one that gave me he showed me that forgiveness, reconciliation, and unconditional love can heal the human heart and restore the soul. And we need to all pray for him, pray for his healing. But when he came and sat down beside me, he called me sister. I called him brother. To this day, we call each other sister and brother. Doug, you know that. He's the one that gave me the courage and strength to find my voice, that I wanted to leave a different legacy for my sons, and that was of peace and reconciliation.
Great.
Let's do. Why don't can you two ask your questions together, Olivia and Barbara? Quickly, because we have to wrap it up.
My question is, in today's political world, and recognizing that Donald Trump is extremely popular in Alabama, do you see a relationship between the earlier years in Alabama and that political support there? And I, too, am a Doug Jones supporter. I don't vote there, but I do send money there. Well, I could speak in more than one way, but I just wondered what some of your insights are over these decades, because I lived in Trussville, Alabama, beginning at age 4, and then lived in many other places in Alabama in my young adult years, and have been in this area since '83.
Olivia, why don't you just say what you have to say quickly, and then maybe Peggy can weave them together.
So, Peggy,
Olivia is the former Birmingham News correspondent who covered Wallace.
So I covered him in '82 during that race, and spent the primary night of the runoff with George McMillan with him in his bedroom at his house. And during that night, he thought that he was losing. So the Montgomery TV stations had the returns backwards. So he was telling me all of his regrets and, you know, his sorrows about the way that he had behaved and things that he had said and so on. And I frankly had to take him at his word, but I will say, because I think he is one of the most formidable politicians that I ever covered, and he had quite the talent for reinventing himself. And he certainly scared the daylights out of me the first time I ever interviewed him, because he put me on notice that he knew my daddy and that my Uncle Harvey had given him one of his first campaign contributions in 1958. And of course I'm like, say it ain't so. All of which is to say, I just want to thank you for your courage in coming forward and writing this book, because your father was who he was, and the kind of family that you grew up in, that many of us did in Alabama, that had very strong father figures. I know that that was very hard for you. And so I just want to thank you for your courage in coming forward and everything that you have done since then. And the only thing I just want to ask is, just like your daddy was talking to me that night in 1982, I just want to know if he ever talked to you and your siblings after that about the way that he thought about what he had done in the past.
Yes, the last couple of years of his life, he would call Mark and I late at night, and we'd go over many nights, and he would want to talk, and we would just let him talk. And he would talk about, he regretted his stand on race and segregation, and he just, I think that he reflected on his past and on his politics, and I think he reflected on just his past actions, but he regretted his stand on race and the segregation. We went over there many nights.
There's a scene in the book where Mark has taken notes, and it's
yes,
yeah, it's pretty great.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Any comments, closing comments about comparing him to the Trump phenomenon, because they are identical pretty much.
Pretty much. Yeah. I think that I would say that my father had the capacity to change. A lot of you have a lot of people out there that don't think he changed. Of course, I do. I do not think the president has the capacity to change.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming out. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can go to the register and do that. We ask that you please take your chairs and put them to something solid as you fold them up.